Good afternoon, brethren. Hope you're having a good week this week. Just bear with me a sec here. I almost completely lost my voice about a week ago, so it's still a little bit raspy at the moment, so just bear with me. Big welcome to everyone here and to everyone on the webcast and anyone who's new and visiting today. Now, we are currently in what has been described as the silly season, with the world gearing up to celebrate Christmas in a few weeks' time. Now, it's a time when many of us in God's church reflect on the comparison between the world's substitutes and counterfeits to what God has opened our eyes to and given to us in the church. Now, most of you here are quite familiar with the pagan origins of mainstream Christianity's biggest festival. Now, just as a quick refresher, let's look at a few encyclopedia quotes summarising the origins of Christmas. Now, the Encyclopedia Americana says, Christmas was, according to many authorities, not celebrated in the first centuries of the Christian church. A feast was established in memory of this event, referring to Christ's birth, in the 4th century AD. Now, in the 5th century, the Western Church ordered it to be celebrated forever on the day of the old Roman feast of the birth of Sol. Now, Jesus and the apostles never kept Christmas. The Encyclopedia Britannica states that the first Christians continued to observe the Jewish festivals, though in a new spirit as commemorations of events which those festivals had foreshadowed. And if we read in the new Schaff-Herzog Encyclopedia of Religious Knowledge, it tells us the following. How much the date of the festival depended upon the pagan Brumalia on December 25, following the Saturnalia, December 17 to 24, and celebrating the shortest day of the year and the new sun, cannot be accurately determined. The pagan festival, with its riot and merrymaking, was so popular that Christians were glad of an excuse to continue its celebration with little change in spirit and in manner. Now, God's feast days were exchanged by the Roman Church for pagan feast days with a Christian veneer in order to convert more pagans to mainstream Christianity. They compromised with the world, giving the people what they emotionally wanted instead of sticking with God's truth. They didn't love the truth, but gave the people a more socially acceptable counterfeit. Now, today, I'd like to look at one of Satan's key strategies in deceiving people, counterfeiting the truth, and how we can protect ourselves from those counterfeits. And not just the big ones, but also the more subtle ones that even we in the church can be vulnerable to. Now, before I do that, I'd like to spend a little bit more time looking more closely at one particular figure who has come to dominate the religious festival of Christmas, that of Santa Claus. Now, let's look at the origins of Santa and how masterful a counterfeit he has come to be at this time of year. Now, in its article on Santa Claus, WIKIPEDIA tells us the following about the origins of Santa Claus. Now, Saint Nicholas of Myra was a 4th century Greek Christian bishop of Myra in Lycia, a province of the Byzantine Empire, now in Turkey. Nicholas was famous for his generous gifts to the poor. Folklorist Margaret Baker maintains that the appearance of Santa Claus, or Father Christmas, whose day is the 25th of December, owes much to Odin, the old blue-hooded, cloaked, white-bearded gift-bringer of the north, who rode the midnight winter sky on his 8-footed steed, Sleipnir, visiting the people with gifts. Odin transformed into Father Christmas, then Santa Claus, prospering with St. Nicholas and the Christ child, becoming a leading player on the Christmas stage. Now, Odin was the chief Norse god and the father of Thor, who most people remember from the movies. Now, Odin was the Norse equivalent of the Roman god Saturn, whose festival, the Saturnalia, was transformed by the Roman Church into Christmas. Now let's take a look at some of the similarities between Santa and Jesus, starting off with Santa's appearance. Now Santa's head and hairs are white as snow. Now, who else has head and hairs as white as snow? Well, in Revelation 1 verse 14 we read what Jesus Christ looks like. It says, his head and his hairs were white like wool and white as snow. Now Santa's clothes are red. Now who else has clothes which are red? Well, in Revelation 19 verse 13 we read the following about Jesus Christ upon his return in the future to earth. And it says, and he was clothed with a vesture dipped in blood, and his name is called the Word of God. Now, Revelation 1:15 also says that Jesus' feet were as if they burned in a furnace. Now it's interesting that Santa comes down through people's furnace or chimneys. Now Jesus is traditionally believed to have been a carpenter, and Santa is also known as a carpenter who makes children's toys. Now let's notice a few more similarities between God and Santa. Now Santa rides upon the heavens in his sleigh, pulled along by his flying reindeer. In Deuteronomy 33 verse 26 we read the following about God. There is no one like the God of Jeshurun, who rides the heavens to help you, and in his excellency on the clouds. Now we know that Santa cries, ho, ho, ho. Now who else has used this expression? Now in Zechariah 2 verse 6 in the King James Version we read, ho, ho, come forth and flee from the land of the north, saith the Lord. Now like God, Santa is all-knowing, who knows who's been naughty and who's been nice. Now like God, Santa judges who's good and who's bad, and he tells children, ask and it will be given unto you. Now in a moment, in the twinkling of an eye, Santa appears all over the world. In one night, the all-powerful Santa delivers millions and millions of gifts to children all around the world. Now, who could do that? Now, who really believes that? Well, most little children who've been preached to about Santa. I mean, nothing is too hard for their Santa. They love their Santa. And like God's spirit, Santa has his own spirit that we know as the Christmas spirit. Now, where does Santa live? Now, I think we all know, of course, that Santa lives at the North Pole, but have you ever given any thought to why he comes from the North Pole? Well, to understand that, we need to understand a little about the pagan gods of the ancient world. Now, William F. Warren, in his book Paradise Found, identified the North Celestial Pole as the home of the supreme god of ancient races. He wrote, the religions of all ancient nations associate the abode of the supreme god with the North Pole, the centre of heaven, or with the celestial space immediately surrounding it. Now in Rome, this ancient sun god was known as Saturn, and the Saturnalia, which became Christmas, celebrated the death and rebirth of the old sun god Saturn. Now, just as Saturn was said to be at the North Celestial Pole, so too does Santa live at the North Pole. Now, there are some mythologists who believe, based on this information, that we were once part of a binary star system in ancient times. Now, that is one possibility, and it's interesting to note in relation to that Genesis 1 speaks of the greater and lesser light as opposed to the sun and the moon. Now that said, a more likely possibility is that this is an echo of God's throne in heaven being located around the North Celestial Pole. Now we read in Isaiah 14 verse 13, for you have said in your heart, talking about Lucifer, I will ascend into the heaven, I will exalt my throne above the stars of God. I will also sit on the mount of the congregation on the farthest sides of the north. Now in 1994, the satire magazine The Onion carried a parody of Santa Claus titled, Ho, 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 I Am God. Now even though it was written as a blasphemous parody, Many things run true in the article. And the article had this to say: I love visiting each and every one of your homes, stuffing your stockings with toys and enjoying the milk and cookies you leave for me. But mostly I love Christmas because it's a celebration of my son, Jesus the Christ. You see, I'm God. Don't I look familiar? I'm old, I have a white beard, I love everyone. I'm the same God as the one that you and your mummy and daddy worship on Sundays. Okay, I admit it, I'm not God. But I'm better than God. I'm jollier, and I give you real toys, not boring old psalms and empty promises that you can only collect when you die. Worship me, not him. Worship Santa. I am God. End of quote. Now, it seems to be an unusual coincidence that the name Santa is actually an anagram of the name Satan, whose stated intention at the time that he rebelled against God was to be like the Most High and to be worshipped like God. Now today, millions of children are lovingly giving Santa their God-given, childlike faith. The fairy tale of Santa in reality is a counterfeit of the blessed hope of the coming of Jesus Christ. Now, in his book, The Ultimate Source of All Supernatural Phenomena, Ronald Wolodiger writes the following: Satan has tried his best to be like God, and in effect has counterfeited or substituted everything God has revealed to him. But everything Satan has changed is inferior, perverted and twisted, just like him. The following are some of the great counterfeiter's accomplishments. 1. He counterfeited the Messiah for mankind through Nimrod and the Messiah's mother through Semiramis. He counterfeited Christ's birthday for Nimrod's. He counterfeited God's church with a false church that masquerades as the true church. He counterfeited God's ministers with his false ministers. He counterfeited God's doctrines by changing A, the Sabbath for Sunday, B, Easter for Passover, C, God's family with the Trinity, and D, the truth about heaven and hell, and instituted the concept of purgatory. Satan always mixes a little bit of the truth with a lot of lies and copies, duplicates, imitates, counterfeits God's truth. End of quote. Now, counterfeits are things of little or no value that are made to look like and pass for things which really do have value. In other words, they are cheap, worthless substitutes for the real thing. Now, Satan tries to divide us, to entice us with counterfeits that draw us away from God and away from his people. Now, some subtle counterfeits that are pushed onto us by our left-wing media include humanism and political correctness. And while we may not be fooled by the major doctrines where we differ from mainstream Christianity, there are more subtle doctrines that do the rounds in the Church of God. And then there are our own personal pet ideas, which we have to be cautious about, as they may turn out to be subtle counterfeits that we can get too emotionally carried away with. Now, how can we protect ourselves from falling for religious counterfeits? Well, there are a couple of simple points we can apply that will guard our minds from such counterfeits. Now, the first is to have a love for the truth as opposed to loving our own interpretation of the truth if the two differ. Now, in 2 Thessalonians 2 and verses 9 to 10, it speaks about the coming false prophet, and it says that his coming is according to the working of Satan with all power and signs and lying wonders, and with all deceit of unrighteousness in those who perish because they did not receive the love for the truth, so that they might be saved. Now, in 2 Timothy chapter 4, verses 3 and 4, Paul told Timothy, "For the time will come when they will not endure sound doctrine, but," notice this, "after their own lust shall they heap to themselves teachers, having itching ears, and they shall turn away their ears from the truth, and shall be turned unto fables." We could certainly list Santa amongst those. Now, most people believe what they emotionally want to believe, even when it logically can be shown to not be the truth. Now, if the truth is inconvenient because it requires more sacrifice, or admit that we've been wrong, or counterfeit views are more socially acceptable than the truth, most people will chase after the counterfeit. A love of the truth means that we will follow the truth, even if it is inconvenient to us, and even if we have to admit humble pie and admit that we are wrong. We will follow what we logically know to be right, like, say, Mr. Spock, rather than what we emotionally want. Now, the second point about how we can guard our minds against counterfeits is embedded in the Day of Atonement ceremony with the 2 goats. Now, the only way they could tell which goat was the one for the Lord and which goat was the one for Azazel was to cast lots and to seek the answer from God. Now, Proverbs 3 verse 5 talks about trusting in God and not leaning on our own understanding. The second point is to have humility and not lean on our own understanding. And we do this by diligently seeking the truth from God and wisdom from a multitude of counselors. Now, while beliefs and doctrines can be counterfeits, Satan's ultimate counterfeit is his way of get. Now, Satan tells us that the way to happiness is his get way, which is a counterfeit to God's true way of give and love to others. So in conclusion, we need to properly discern both good and evil and to prove all things using God's word, the Bible, which is truth. We need to have a love for the truth rather than following our own personal desires when they differ, so we do not fall for any of Satan's worthless counterfeits. Let us hold fast to God's truth and promises, which are real and truly are the real thing.